You take your Bibles and turn to, as if you couldn't tell what I was doing, but Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. So, kind of make sure we're all on the same page of what's happening tonight. So it is an introduction to the actual book. I freely admitted that we had basically a 5-message introductory to it. Most of the stuff tonight, I think, is going to be new material. Some of it will be overlap because nobody was here for the first Sunday that we dealt with a lot of this. And so do want to kind of make sure that people that were out of town are kind of caught up to what we're thinking about, what's up. No, go ahead and do it for me. Okay. No, I'm saying do the slides and everything. Okay. Just make sure that we're all kind of on the same page with what we're talking about. And generally speaking, my messages are all going to be on Sunday night. This is the only Wednesday night I'm taking for it, mainly because I do think it's going to be more of a lesson type, and Wednesday nights are, in my opinion, a little bit more conducive to that, but we will be preaching through the book. And just to remind us, I have 13 messages planned. I am preaching 13 messages out of the book of Daniel. That is what I'm doing. So I'm not even going to make an attempt to claim that it's a verse-by-verse exposition. That will not be the case. It's more of finding a single message in each chapter is more the line we're going to take. I was even looking at chapter 9 earlier today, and I may end up talking about 3 verses out of Daniel chapter 9, just kind of just the way we're going to handle the material. It's not my intentions to get completely bogged down in prophecy and explaining the difference between a Jewish year, a Gentile year, a solar year, and a lunar year when you're adding up math. I would teach a lesson on it and have no problem, but I don't know 100% how much value people would gain for that on their own. And really my point is not to teach prophecy, even though obviously more than half of the book is definitely geared that way. Really, my goal is to talk about how the Most High ruleth in the affairs of men, and prophecy will be conducive to that. But my goal is to drive the point home that God is ruling no matter what we see happening here. So read Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, which he brought the vessels of treasure into the house of God." So we basically, we'll be back to that verse in just a second. So our introductory lesson here, let me kind of tell you what the aim of tonight is. It is to orient us all on David's historical span, the bilingual structure, the Babylonian setting, and the literary form, and really most importantly, the controlling theology behind it. What is the book of Daniel, kind of the main one-sentence takeaway from that? And it is this: Daniel records how the Most High rules over earthly kingdoms and preserves his people while doing so, even while kingdoms are rising and falling. So we're going to answer 4 questions tonight. The first is, when does Daniel take place? And again, I spent an entire lesson on that, so it'll be much briefer, but still make sure maybe kind of pulling out some dates that I kind of glossed over in that lesson and making sure we understand when things happened, why Daniel is written in 2 languages, what kind of world was Babylon? And again, one of my main points is, what is the controlling truth of the book? I don't want to get to the end of Daniel and, number one, you have enjoyed the narrative part, right? I mean, it's hard not to. I mean, I can appreciate that. I mean, there's a reason that you teach a lot of the stories of the book of Daniel in Sunday school, right? They're captivating. Little kids, there's an affinity of, I say little kids, really everybody, right? I'm looking forward to preaching some of the narrative. But I'm also looking forward to preaching the back half of the book too. And the result of that and the reason for that is because it's all driving the same truth home, that the Most High ruleth in the nations of men. So our path forward tonight, I have 4 points. It's a book rooted in history. It's a book written in 2 languages. It's a book set in Babylon, and a book that talks about ruling from heaven. So we read the first 2 verses, and we won't spend a lot of time there next week because we've definitely touched on this multiple times. But you read all of it, and there's a verse 1 and 2, and there's a very real sense in which you come to that point and be like, well, that's it. The nation of Israel's lost. They've been defeated. They've been conquered. The end is here. But I think that from a more of a biblically astute point of view, that's really not a very accurate representation. There's no doubt a very real sense in which Nebuchadnezzar, at this point, verses 1 and verse number 2, Nebuchadnezzar kind of had the attitude of, look how great I am. And Nebuchadnezzar definitely lent that direction to understate the reality, and that's true, right? He beat the nation of Israel, and the nation of Israel. I think that the surrounding countries were well known of the kind of the reality of they claim to serve the one true God, and I beat them. But there was a phrase in verse number 2 that's very, in one sense, it is the governing thesis of the entire book. And it's this: and the Lord gave, right? Nebuchadnezzar didn't beat, the Lord gave. And this is very important. And not only apart from the reality of they should have seen this coming. It was talked about Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Ezekiel would have been after this. But still, they should have seen this coming. A lot of the minor prophets were pre-fall. It would have been very easy to be in that place, and Daniel on his march to Babylon, being carted over there, thinking, well, Nebuchadnezzar beat us. And I don't ever want to go through the book and have in your mind that Nebuchadnezzar beat the nation of Israel. Because from a spiritual perspective, that is definitely not what happened. The Lord gave. He was working out his plan even in the midst of the destruction of his nation, the captivity of his people, and really the desecration of his temple and the land that they are. And so we need to remember who actually won. Everything visible was saying Nebuchadnezzar won. Jerusalem had been besieged. Judah's king was defeated. God's vessels were carried away. The cream of the crop of the men of the nation of Israel were taken captive. But we need to understand the reason that this is happening is because the Lord gave them unto the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar may have showed up, but the Lord gave. Nebuchadnezzar may have besieged, but it was the Lord that gave. Nebuchadnezzar carried it away, but the Lord gave. I really want, this is my goal, and Lord willing, I'm gonna hammer this almost every week. I want you to get, when you think of the book of Daniel from now on, I want us to think about that the God was ruling in everything, not in that, but in everything that's ever happened in history. The first theological statement in Daniel is not about Nebuchadnezzar's strength, but rather it's about the sovereignty of God in the affairs of nations. So, number one, a book rooted in history. So my guess is if I look around, and I could be wrong about this, but let's say maybe for the wider, even biblically literate culture, I could ask you, what's Daniel 1 on? And probably between all of y'all, you could tell me what Daniel 1 on. Daniel 2, probably some of y'all could get that. Daniel 3, what is Daniel 3? Anybody know? The 3 Hebrew children, I think that's correct. Daniel 4, I think you're right, actually. But it really, it's regardless. I'm making it a point. And we talk about chapter 6, and then talk about Belshazzar with their handwriting on the wall. Even you're familiar with the story of Nebuchadnezzar and driven out, right? But then let me say, what's Daniel chapter 10 about, right? And maybe there's a couple of people definitely probably sitting here that if they thought about it could, but I would say, generally speaking, we're much more familiar with the first half of the book than we are the second half of the book. And I understand that for sure. I myself am, even right now, I'm not quite 100% sure what Daniel chapter 10 is off the top of my head either, right? But I hope to remedy that and to do so in such a way that will make it memorable for all of us. But more to the point is, this is not a disconnected group of stories followed by inexplicable prophetic charts, right? You get into some of the back half of the book of Daniel, and if your eyes aren't kind of going in circles, come talk to me, because I'm very interested in how you managed to do that, right? There's a lot of things that you got to think about and try to understand what's going on. So let's go to the next slide and just make sure that we're all on the same page. So we do have in 605, this is basically where verses 1 and verse 2 come in. All these are in BC, before Christ, before Common Era, whatever your method of that is. 605, this is when this happened. Verses 1 and 2, And if you recall, I can't go into everything again, but the whole carrying away to Jerusalem, it happened over about a decade and a half, depending on what exactly you're qualifying as that. And so in 597, there was even a greater deportation. That's when Ezekiel would have gone into captivity. He didn't go to Babylon. He went to the land of Shinar, I think. I could be wrong about that, but he went to somewhere else. In 586, this was the final collapse of Jerusalem. But Daniel really had been gone at that point 19 years. So he had been in Babylon for a good long time when you would use the term Jerusalem officially and completely fell. And it was really, I'm roughing these dates, 33 years, I think, or 27. It was about 33 years from Jerusalem falling to where Daniel receives the vision of the four beasts in the first year of Belshazzar. So Daniel had been in Babylon for 52 years before God had ever spoke to him. And let me say this here. I probably shouldn't be talking about that. Let me say this here just because. So there's an interesting thing that Gabriel calls Daniel later in the book. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but he on multiple occasions talked about thou who art greatly beloved. And I don't know what the connection is. I'll spend the next several services thinking about it, or weeks thinking about it. But Daniel is probably one of the most prophetic books in the Old Testament. And God often, or Gabriel, I think by the word of God, calls him greatly beloved. And the writer in the New Testament, of which writes the most prophetic, the Apostle John with the book of Revelation, he was the disciple whom Jesus loved. I'm not quite sure what a connection is there. I just find it, a bare minimum, interesting and probably not without merit. And maybe we'll get into that at some point. Had nothing to do with this slide, but his second vision, so really pretty quick on the heels of that, just 2 years later, he received the vision of the ram and the he-goat in Belshazzar's third year, 539, so we're 11, 12 years after that second vision. That's when Belshazzar's feast in Daniel chapter 5. So that Daniel 5 is when Belshazzar's feast was going on. And that's when the Medes and the Persians came. We were talking about even this night the kingdom is taken from thee. And then it's in 536, so 3 later, that's Daniel 10:1, is going to be his final vision in the third year of Cyrus. So the book generally takes place from 536 to 605. You could do the math. It's going to be 540, 64, 69 years, basically. And he was obviously a young man. So David was between is that not right? Whatever. No, okay. But he was between 70 and 80 probably at the time of the book's close. So he was an old man who had spent I'm going to use the phrase his entire life in Babylon. I realize it's like me, if somebody said, where are you from? I don't typically tell them Dallas, even though I was born there, I lived there for 5 years. I'm from here, right? If we get into the minutiae and really have a long conversation, I was born in Dallas, my parents moved back, right? But this is where I've lived. This is where I live. I think Daniel would definitely, I don't know at what point you kind of get into that, but I think after 70 years in a place, pretty safe to say, I'm from Babylon, right? This is where he would have, at least from a temporal point of view, have had that. Let's make sure that we're covering everything here. We could, let's go to the next slide. So this is important for us to understand. I'm not going to prove every point of this slide tonight just because it probably could take 15 or 20 minutes just to prove it, but the book of Daniel is not in chronological order. You cannot just begin reading in chapter 1 and read through the end and think they all happened to that event. Let me at least tell you the chronological order. You have Daniel chapter 1 happened first, Daniel 2 through 4 happened second, and then you skip to Daniel chapter 7 chronologically, and then Daniel chapter 8, and then Daniel chapter 5, and then Daniel 6 through 9, and Daniel 10 through 12. Let me just tell you why we know that. Because basically when he's talking about some of the visions he has in like chapter 7, it talks about in the first year of the reign of the king, I'm almost positive it's Belshazzar, and we know that Belshazzar by chapter 7 was already gone, right? So does that make sense? So we know that Daniel 7, the vision he had, took place in an earlier king. And so it's not going to be completely chronological. I don't know that it necessarily if you're reading through it, you may not catch it unless you're writing. I got people fact checking me or whatever. That's all right. I could be, that may not be completely right. Don't everybody fact check me, right? But the reason that this is important is because if you are paying pretty close attention, you would get to Daniel chapter 7 and be like, that king was already dead, and yet we're saying in the first year. So I think it really just is intimating the fact that it's not chronological. And I think more importantly than that, the book is arranged primarily according to subject, language, and theological structure. And really, I think most of the Bible, the way that we have it ordered, it's not chronological, right? And that's why if you just read through your Bible, people, yeah, everybody wants to fact check. You read through the Bible, and you would get to Ezra and Nehemiah pretty quick after like the narrative of the kings, but that happened many decades, I believe more than decades, it happened quite a bit after, right? So a lot of the Bible's not chronological, it's arranged by content, and Daniel is no exception. You have to remember, Daniel doesn't make the claim for or even allege that it's a diary written, first day in captivity, 17th day in captivity. It doesn't even make that claim. It basically is not a group of unconnected stories, but a group of stories that are more grouped according to content than they are the date that it happened, if that makes any sense. If you write your autobiography, I don't recommend writing that, but again, there's theological issues at stake here. So Daniel lived through the fall of Judah, the end of the ascendancy of Babylon, the fall of Babylon, and the rise of Persia. And we know that it talks about in Daniel 1:21, we're not going to turn over there, but how Daniel continued even to the first year of King Cyrus. So, next screen, a book written in 2 languages. This is, I think most of us are probably at least generally familiar with this, but the book of Daniel has written in Hebrew, which is what, other than the book of Daniel, I'm almost positive my brain is fact-checking myself, and I feel I lost confidence halfway through my sentence. But I think Daniel is the only one that has any Aramaic in it. The rest of the Old Testament is all written in Hebrew, except for parts of Daniel. And there's not value to it. I'm not saying there's not value. There's significance to that, right? And so let's talk about it first. So there are 2 major literary movements. Again, chapters 1 through 6 are basically what I would consider to be narrative, even though there are at least two visions, right? There's a lot going on, right? So I think there's at least 2 visions. So it's not this, even what's considered to be the normal division of it is not 100% ironclad, right? There's all, and that's true with a lot of books of the Bible. But generally speaking, chapters 1 through 6 primarily tell of court narratives. Daniel and his companions living under Gentile rulers. Chapters 7 through 12 primarily record prophetic visions, prophetic visions, right? Since we decided to butcher that word. Symbolic revelation showing the rise and fall of kingdoms, the suffering of saints, and the final triumph of God's kingdom. So the stories in chapters 1 through 6 show how God's people live under earthly kingdoms. The visions show, I think, even to a greater extent, how these earthly kingdoms appear from heaven, right? We move from living in the earthly kingdom to the way God is viewing things going on in the greater things. So we do have basically, we have 3 divisions. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4. The first part of it, I would argue, is written in Hebrew. And then in Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, the second part of it to 7:28, which would be the end of chapter 7, is written in Aramaic. And then Daniel 8:1 through the end of the book goes back to Hebrew. And let's see, do we want to turn over? I do have it. Daniel chapter 2, verse 4. If you're in Daniel, I will show you where it says that. Then, Daniel 2:4, then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show thee the interpretation. So it says that the Chaldeans in Syriac, and manuscript evidence backs this part up as well. And so he switches to, it calls it Syriac. Would you like the 10-minute explanation on why Syriac and Aramaic are the same thing? Or just take my word for it at this point. Y'all could do your own shit. So they're the same thing, just different terms for it. And then it swapped back at the beginning of Daniel chapter 8. So let's see here. So chapter 2, verse 7 I think that it's more than just he decided to write some chapters in Aramaic. I think this contains content that belongs together. So let's see, chapters 2 through 7. So in chapter 2 is the vision that King Nebuchadnezzar had, that he was basically ready to kill everybody over. Daniel said, give me some time. And they prayed about it. He came up with them, and it was the head of gold and so on, right off the top of my head. And then you have in chapter 3, deliverance from death, which would have been the three Hebrew children in the burning fiery furnace. And then in chapter 4, you have Nebuchadnezzar's story of being humbled, right? Everybody's familiar with that. At the end of it, it says, I have it right on the tip of my tongue. He puts it like this. I just love the way it puts it. And those that walk in pride, he is able to abase there at the end of chapter 4. Then chapter 5, you have another proud king humbled, which is Belshazzar. And it's the meeny, tell you farce, and thou art weighed. You're weighed in the balances and found wanting, and tonight thy kingdom is taken from thee. That's chapter 5. Chapter 6, you go back to deliverance from death with Daniel in the lion's den. And then in chapter 7, you have what I would contend to be, and I think generally accepted, is the 4 kingdoms given again from a different perspective. And so again, you have kind of I meant to look up the word. There's a Hebrewism that talks about how something kind of builds to a point and then comes back down, kind of repeating the same content. I don't remember the term for it, but that's kind of what's going on here. It's kind of like repeating in reverse after you get to the halfway point. Does everybody shake your head and act like you're following this, right? Okay. So all that's in Aramaic, and I want to talk about, what time is it? Do we have time? We do not have time to talk about that. Okay. And then we move to chapter 8 through 12. And let me sum this up really quickly. We'll be into it here in a couple of weeks or months. It moves more towards dealing with the nation of Israel and kind of their role in the end of it. I'm not going to say 100% exclusively. Like, again, you start dividing any Bible. I looked in a lot of commentaries. I have a Wilmington Guide to the Bible dictionaries. And it's like everybody basically agrees, but everybody's kind of, cuts their pie in a little bit of a different place. And so I'm acknowledging that reality. But generally speaking, chapters 8 through 12 is Israel heavy on the way that the end of the world is going to occur. And it's important to know that, especially as we're going through the first kind of literary section here, that all of these stories are kind of mirrored on the other half in a different way. And again, it's just all God showing his handiwork there, which is interesting because most of the time when you just kind of divide the book between its two halves, you would have 1 through 6 and then 7 through 12. But the way that it's divided here, I think more naturally, literarily, and theologically, chapters 2 through 7 belong together better, even though that some of them definitely go into prophetic visions, definitely in chapter 7 for sure. So let's see here. Let me see, are we covering everything? And let me give you this here. This is probably a good point here. That Daniel was not necessarily just written for Hebrews, right? The fact that it was written in a language that was more commonly spoken made it much more accessible, even at the time, to a wider world. And I think that this is what's my next slide? I don't know for sure. Back up. Is that this is kind of the takeaway from this before we move to point number 3. It's that the kingdoms of this world are temporary, kind of regardless. And some of these kingdoms, we are at a high level of certainty about what kingdoms he's talking about because he names them by name, right? Greek and Persia immediately come to mind. So it's not like, wow, what nation or empire are we speaking about here? He calls them out by name, but they're all temporary, right? That's a recurring theme, whether it's with the idol and the rocks smashing it, and that's kind of a recurring theme there. Kings are held accountable. Now Nebuchadnezzar for sure lifted himself up pretty high in pride, and God took care of that problem. We'll talk about when we get there whether or not Nebuchadnezzar may have had a salvation experience and at least draw some observations about that. But then you kind of flip the coin to his son Belshazzar, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but it talks about how, you saw what happened to your dad and you're still acting like this, right? And really God is saying, I have the capability of no matter how big and bad you think you are to bring you down to size. And all authority, really the lesson is all authority is delegated. And this ought to be helpful to us because, it's easy to look at politics and socioeconomics, that may not be the best, but it's the kind of the geopolitical aspects of the world and say, look at what this person's doing, look at what this person's doing. And I say you read through the book of Daniel, you ought to say, look at what God's doing. Now, don't mistake that to mean it always makes perfect sense. In fact, I'm going to again paraphrase, but I think it's in Daniel chapter 9, where he's reading the book of Jeremiah, and he basically is like, I don't know what somebody explain this to me, right? So even though Daniel, I think, had an inside view that 99, the vast majority of the world never got, he still didn't even understand everything, and he was living in a pretty negative physical standpoint from where he was at. And so really the takeaway from that is that the Most High is ruling over the kingdoms of men. This is what we want to do. So we do have a book set in Babylon. Next slide, please. And this is, I want to spend a few minutes here, just very briefly, because we want to understand. I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of Babylon, but this was not a primitive village of mud huts occupied by barbarians. Now, maybe if you want to compare it to where we're at today, we're pretty far along, but we've come pretty far in the last 150 years. So, there wasn't a whole lot of distance up until the early 1900s. But this was the greatest empire that the world had ever seen to this point. There were some Chinese dynasties over there that were no slouches in their own right, but just kind of from a recorded civilization point of view, this was one of the first. Not the first, Assyrians were definitely the first, but one of the first kind of major empires in the world. And it was located in Euphrates. A quiz time. Does anybody know what the modern day country would be? I know some of y'all I'm sure know, so maybe if you don't know what the modern day country of Babylon would be. Iraq. Yeah, it would be modern day Iraq. Located along the river Euphrates. I always found it interesting back when we were in Iraq quite a bit. They would talk about crossing the river Euphrates. I was like, that's weird, right? It seems weird to do that, but that's still there. And Nebuchadnezzar definitely expanded it. I would say that Nebuchadnezzar was the height of the Babylonian Empire, and I would say that mainly because his son had it taken from him, so clearly it didn't go up from there. But he made everything grand, and it was kind of on a pharaohific level of personal aggrandizement, right? It's kind of blowing up what the city was, and really more of a monument to himself. It had massive fortifications. I was reading, nope, that could have been the Romans. I think that was the Romans, so scratch that. It was some Roman built a big set of baths that still exist today, but that wasn't Babylon. I'm mixing up my ancient empires, right? So, but it was massive fortifications, temples, the thing called the processional way, which you can kind of still go walk down. They figured out a way to do glazed bricks, so it would kind of have a shiny reflection there. You have I think it's one of the seven wonders of the ancient world is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. I'm not very sure what all that entails, other than gardens that are hanging on some level. All right, that's my understanding of it. And you have the Ishtar Gate. It's reconstructed even to this day. Has lions, bulls, mythical creatures against a brilliant blue surface, right? If you looked very hard on Google Images, this is going to be one of the first things that kind of pops up. But really, I want us to understand that this wasn't some backwater tribe that came in and beat the nation of Israel. I've already talked about how God orchestrated, but this was a legitimate empire of highly advanced civilization for that time. They projected wealth, military power, intellectual sophistication, religious magnificence, political permanence. They were the kind of the country to beat. They would have been the Pan-Babylonian Empire at that point, right? They were kind of running the entire thing. And this is important because Daniel was not placed in a situation and an environment. Let's see how much I have left and how much we're going to get dug. Ooh, okay. He was not placed in a culture that was weak. He was placed in the most impressive culture of its day. And you find in chapter 1, and we'll dig into it a little bit next week, but our focus is going to probably be a little bit elsewise, but they were practiced in the They were practiced in the practice. They were well practiced at when they conquered a people of how they handled them. And basically they took the best and the brightest and they brought them to Babylon and made them Babylonians, right? There's probably a lot of political things that go on into that, but they had this, it wasn't like they found Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and been like, you know what, we should take these to Babylon. Like this was what they did. They would remove them from their land, re-educate them, or rename their identities, reshape their appetites, and redeploy their abilities. I mean, we need to be honest. I mean, they were captives. They were captives on some level, but I mean, they had good jobs, right? Like it's not like they were brought and made to, clean out the horse stalls or something. Like they were taking the best and the brightest and using their abilities to that point. And that was really the pressure that they experienced in Babylon. It was learn what we've got to teach, speak the way that we talk, eat what we eat, answer the names that we give you, and use your gifts in service to our kingdom. And so it wasn't so much, Ezekiel would have had a little bit of a different take. Oh, I couldn't get bogged down in Ezekiel. But Daniel, he didn't get there. And the main problem or the main issue was, I'm living a life of persecution and abuse, and it's hard to serve God when life is so hard. He lived in the palace, generally. I don't know about specifically, but that idea, and had good jobs and was eating meat from the king's table. So the biggest problem wasn't woe is me. It's more along the lines of, this ain't that bad. And I think that ought to speak a lesson to us. Where we're at in our nation and in our time, the problem is not that we have it so hard as Christians. The more likely problem is that we have it so good as Christians. And the world, on a level, to stay with my train of thought here, embraces us on some level. You can do whatever you want. There's no litmus test. If you want to be a Christian around, nobody cares, like nobody cares at all, right? And the greatest danger we have here is not being persecuted, but not being persecuted. And I'm not entirely positive that not being persecuted is a better state than being persecuted when it comes to making good Christians. So Babylon was not trying to kill Daniel. They were trying to make Daniel one of them. And this is important. So I say that. Let's talk about the furnace in the room, if you will, right? And the reality is I know that the fiery furnace existed. I know the Daniel and the lions that existed, but that was not their first go-to, right? They didn't bring them into Babylon and hold them over a lion's den and said, sacrifice to our gods. Their first attempt was assimilation, not execution, right? And there was definitely persecution that came into play, but the first danger was just trying to be assimilated into their culture. And then let me just very quickly touch on this. Babylon is... When we think about Babylon, especially in the book of Daniel, it is first literally a city and an empire. However, the Bible uses the concept of Babylon really from the very beginning all the way to the very end to represent a world system that is against God. I think you find the root of it in Genesis chapter 11. In Daniel chapter 5, it is a very practical aspect of it. And when you move into the New Testament, and especially the book of Revelation, depending on how you completely think about it, but I don't think you can deny the fact that at bare minimum, the spirit of Babylon is alive and well, and the Lord is using that to do it. So let's go, next slide, please. So our fourth and final point, to stay with me for a few minutes, is it was talking about being ruled from heaven. In Daniel chapter 2, you still have your Bibles, Daniel chapter 2 and verse number 20, a few verses to reiterate the recurring, the controlling theme, if you will. Daniel chapter 2, verse 20 and 21, the Bible says, Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changes the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. I read this verse here, and Daniel 4:17, we went over it a few times last Sunday. This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. we need to keep these are two examples for sure this is the controlling theme of the book of Daniel. It's not so much Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, all these cool and kind of fantasy-esque visions that we're trying to figure out what he's being talked about. And the moral of the story, if you will, is that God is still ruling. And we know that because in several stories, you say, well, what's the point of that? He tells you what the point of it, that the Most High ruleth in the affairs of man, and that he changeth the time and season and setteth up kings and kingdoms. So the central message of Daniel is not be brave like Daniel. It's not that could not be an application and or a takeaway that may not have some value in it, but that's not the lesson of the book of Daniel. It's not just merely stand by your convictions. Again, application can be drawn. That's a valid reaction to have, but that's not the driving force of the book of Daniel. The reality is things like that, be brave like Daniel, stand for your convictions, are downstream from the main truth, and it's this: Daniel remained faithful because the Most High rules. It's really more than just looking at Daniel and saying, what an example. It's looking at why Daniel was an example. And really, we look at the book of Daniel and say, oh, what an example. We got to look at the book of Daniel and say, oh, what a God we have. And I think that all of these stories really ought to be driving us back to there. His confidence does not originate in him personally. It originates in his theology. And if your confidence can originate in your theology and not just how smart you are, you'll have a lot better confidence. And I mean that in the best possible way, spiritually and theologically, right? That your confidence needs to be based from your theology, not have confidence in your theology just because you're a confident type of person. Daniel knew that Nebuchadnezzar was not ultimate, Babylon was not permanent, exile is not accidental. In fact, I mentioned it in our Sunday morning message when we were preaching in Leviticus chapter 26 over in Daniel chapter 9, paraphrasing again. He basically said, we're here like Moses said we would end up here, right? So he understood that we're not here just because Nebuchadnezzar, this is the time when kings go forth to war and we just happen to be next door to him. There was reason and purpose to this. So exile is not accidental. History is not uncontrolled. Israel's God had not been defeated. Faithfulness is never wrong. And the kingdom of God will outlast the kingdom of men. Every maybe an overstatement just because I can't necessarily identify every vision off the top of my head. But generally speaking, the point of all these visions is when everything is said and done, God is still here. The Almighty, the Ancient of Days, the Most High is still ruling even when all of these kingdoms come and go. Let's see here. Next slide, please. Yeah, conclusion. So it's not just God. What time is it? Perfecto. God does not merely just supervise the kingdom of men. The story of Daniel is God saying, this is how I'm going to replace all of these kingdoms with my kingdom ultimately. In Daniel 2:44, you have it there on the screen. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. This matters because otherwise the Most High ruling, kind of our governing, controlling theme, can just kind of sound like the general doctrine of providence, which I'm not demeaning that by any stretch of the imagination, but it's more pointed than that. It's not that God is sovereign, God is provident. Yes, that's all true, that's all theologically correct, but it's more pointed in this. Human empires are temporary. This is one example. I'll just give this to you because it'll be several weeks before we get to it, before we touch on it. In Daniel chapter 2, remember the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had with the idol statue, head of gold, silver, brass, so on and so forth, right? And then in chapter 7, you have what I would argue, what I think it's generally considered, I think, to be always the same. It's the same vision, the same four kingdoms, but the description of them is completely different. And I'm thinking about this, but it's almost like when Nebuchadnezzar sees the kingdoms, oh, it's a great statue, gold and everything. And when God sees them, they're just base animals that just get more and more vile and ferocious and weird and everything. So we look at it and be like, oh, this is amazing. God looks at it and be like, just a bunch of weird animals, dude. And we can tend to be very impressed. You know, when Daniel got done saying, you're the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, like, that's what I'm talking about, right? That was the attitude he had. But when God looked down, he just saw a lion. He just saw a jaguar. And you get to the end of the last kingdom, and it's just like just some weird beast. It's really kind of hard to put our finger on of everything. And it really is this idea of God looks at things differently than we do, and that matters. So the theological progression for us is the Most High permits kingdoms, the Most High limits kingdoms, the Most High judges kingdoms, and the Most High will replace kingdoms. And we should remember that when we're going through the book of Daniel, and we should remember it for our own day and age. I was watching a clip, and it was Pete Hegseth, the Department Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War. And somebody asked him something about a capability we had, and he said, nobody has better capability in the entire world. If we want to do it, we can do whatever we want. And there's probably, from a very physical point of view, I have no doubt that's the case. But every time we hear stuff like that, we should remember the Most High permits kingdoms, limits kingdoms, judges kingdoms, and ultimately replaces all kingdoms. Even if you live in the country that's the biggest and the baddest and the worst that's ever walked the face of the earth with a military that cannot be matched, God still has to give it to you. And when you forget that, you can go read the book about a chapter about Nebuchadnezzar and learn what God thinks about people that forget where they get their power from. So, Babylon did take Daniel from Jerusalem, but it could not remove Daniel from the government of God. It changed his address, changed his education, changed his employment, changed his name, but it didn't change his God. And that ought to be the point that we take away. The Most High is ruling. No matter what you see going on around you, the Most High is ruling. I appreciate your attention. Hopefully it was a kind of a catching us all up to what we're going to think about in the book of Daniel, and maybe hopefully you're looking forward to it as I am. You can stand.